The morning Maren Voss climbed onto her cabin roof with a bolt of canvas under one arm and a hammer in the other. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridgeline of Cinder Notch. The light came in flat and pale the way it does in Montana in early June, when the air still carries the memory of frost in its lowest pockets. She didn't call for help. She didn't wait for the day to warm. She drove the first nail before the roosters in Harlow Flat had finished their argument with the dawn. Below her, the valley floor was green in a way that felt almost dishonest after the gray months. Grass pushing up through the last of the mud, the creek running high and brown with snowmelt smoke rising thin from the chimneys of 30-odd households, arranged along the flat like chips of wood scattered by a careless hand. She could see the false front of Gideon's trading post from the roofline, the whitewashed walls of the Reverend's house, the lean-to behind the livery where two horses stood with their heads down blinking in the new light. She registered all of it the way a soldier registers terrain, not with affection, with measurement. She stretched the canvas tight between four anchor nails, checked the angle against the sun's trajectory, then drove four more nails along the lower edge to create a lip that would catch air and hold it. She'd learned the hard way that canvas laid flat, pressed moisture back into the fruit. You needed the current to move beneath it, the way a river needs a bed with some give. By the time she descended and began slicing the first of the season's apples at the outdoor table she'd built from planks and two sawhorses, the Gerhardt boys were already passing on the road below the ridge. She heard their voices before she saw them, loud the way young men are when they want to be heard, but don't want to seem like they're trying. There she goes again. A pause, then laughter. Building something up there every morning before breakfast. My mother says she's turned peculiar. Maren set the knife against the next apple and drew it through in one motion, wrist rotating to produce a slice that was even from stem to base. She had 12 pounds of apples to work through before the heat peaked and the sun waited for no one's opinion. That was the beginning of what Harlow Flat came to call, with varying degrees of affection and derision, her summer of strange industry. Through June, she strung fish on lengths of twine between the ponderosa pines at the north edge of her clearing. The trout and bass she pulled from the creek at first light. Each morning split and salted and hung to catch the dry mountain air. She built a solar box from salvaged glass panes and sheet tin angled south and used it to dry herbs and root vegetables without fire. She rendered fat in a cast iron kettle and poured it into small crocks sealed with cloth and twine. She bought salt from Walt Gideon in quantities that made him set down his ledger and look at her over his spectacles. Maren, Walt Gideon was a careful man who chose his words the way he chose inventory. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. That's the third 20-pound sack this month. I'm aware of what I bought, Walt. Curing beef. Among other things. He wrote the sale down, but she felt his eyes follow her to the door, the way you watch a weather vane when the air's gone very still. The talk that followed was the kind that starts small in a place like Harlow Flat. A comment at the feed store, a murmur after Sunday service, a joke passed between men leaning against the rail outside Gideon's. By mid-July, it had grown into something with more body to it. Hester Langford told her sister-in-law that the widow Voss had gone touched after losing her boys. Reverend Aldous Crane said in his gentle way that grief took people differently, that some turned inward, that the community ought to extend patience. Walt Gideon said nothing publicly, which in Harlow Flat was its own kind of statement. The men were less circumspect. Earl Dunmore, who ran cattle on the flatland south of town, told anyone who'd listen that a woman with too much time and too little sense was a dangerous combination. She's got more food drying up on that ridge than a trading post, he said one afternoon from his customary position outside the livery hat, pushed back thumbs in his belt. Somebody ought to tell her winter doesn't last 12 months. The women who'd known Maren before the winter of 1883, before the graves, were quieter about it. They remembered a different version of her. A woman who had run the quilting circle, who'd brought soup to sick households, who'd delivered Ida Marsh's youngest when the doctor was snowbound across the pass. That woman had been warm in the particular way of someone who gives without accounting for it. What stood on the ridge now looked like the same woman from a distance, but there was something in the set of her jaw, something in the way her eyes moved across a room, cataloging, measuring, never quite settling, that told you the resemblance was only partial. Maren Voss had buried Eric in February of 1883. She'd wrapped him in the blanket she'd woven the winter before the one with the blue border. He'd always said matched her eyes, and she'd carried him to the ground behind the cabin with her own hands because there was no one to help her, and the snow was still 4 feet deep outside the door. Peter went 2 weeks later. He was 7, old enough to understand what was happening in the abstract way children understand things that are too large for them, young enough that his understanding didn't help him. Lars lasted 3 more days. He was 5. He had Eric's ears and his grandmother's stubbornness, and right up to the end he'd insisted he wasn't cold, which was the most heartbreaking lie Maren had ever been asked to accept. She didn't talk about them. Not to the reverend, not to the women who'd come with food when the thaw finally broke the pass open. She thanked people for what they brought. She answered direct questions. With the minimum required, she went back to work. What she didn't tell anyone, what she hadn't told anyone in 3 years, was the specific texture of what those 3 weeks had been. The sound of the wind in the eaves, the same sound every night until she stopped being able to separate it from the sound of her own breathing. The weight of the oat sack going down measured in small handfuls because she was trying to make it last, knowing even as she measured that it wasn't going to be enough. The moment she understood that understanding something completely doesn't give you any power over it whatsoever. She didn't talk about it. Instead, she'd spent 3 years learning everything she'd failed to know in time. She'd sent for books from Denver Agricultural Texts, preservation guides, a pamphlet on root cellaring from a university extension in Ohio. She'd corresponded with a woman in Nebraska who'd survived 2 hard winters on a homestead, alone trading letters, until she'd extracted every practical detail the woman had to offer. She'd rebuilt her root cellar herself deeper than before, lined with fieldstone and packed straw. She'd learned to read the signs that the almanac didn't print the way ants sealed their hills early, when a bad winter was coming, the migration timing of the gray-crowned rosy finch, the particular color the sky turned in the southwest when the pressure was dropping faster than it should. By the summer of 1886, she wasn't preparing out of anxiety. She was preparing out of knowledge. There was a difference, though. From the outside, it probably looked the same. The boy appeared in her yard for the first time on a Thursday in late June, standing on the far side of the fence, with his arms crossed over the top rail, watching her work with an expression that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite hunger, but lived somewhere between the two. He was tall for 16, still carrying the unfinished quality of someone who's grown faster than his frame, has had a chance to settle into big hands, shoulders starting to broaden, a jaw that hadn't finished deciding what shape it intended to be. He had a bruise yellowing along his left cheekbone that he wasn't making any effort to hide. Maren glanced up from the venison she was slicing into strips for the drying rack. She looked at him long enough to register what she was seeing, then looked back at her work. 3 minutes passed. "If you stand there another 10 minutes, she finally said without looking up, "I'm going to start thinking you want to be useful." A pause. What would useful look like? She nodded toward this pile of trout at the far end of the table, split and waiting to be salted. "There's a knife on the board, the salt crocks beside it. Each one gets a pinch in the body cavity, a pinch along the spine. Don't oversalt the belly, it turns the texture wrong." He came through the gate without being invited, which she noted. He picked up the knife, looked at the fish, looked at how she was working, then started. His first attempt was too heavy on the salt. She didn't correct him immediately. She watched him realize it himself on the second fish, saw him recalibrate, saw the pinch get smaller. That told her something. His name was Caleb Drum. His father was Roy Drum, who had once been a competent man, good with horses, reliable in a work crew, the kind of neighbor you could count on when something needed lifting or fixing. That was before Caleb's mother, Martha, had died of a chest sickness in February of 1884. In the 2 years since Roy had moved from occasional drinking to something more architectural about it, building his days around the bottle the way other men built their days around work. Caleb had been managing the household such as it was since he was 14. He didn't volunteer any of this that first day. Maren didn't ask. She learned it in pieces over the following weeks, the way you learn anything real about a person, not from what they say directly, but from the shape of what they avoid, the things they mention only once, and then steer around the specific quality of their silences. He came back the next morning. She put him to work. He came back the morning after that. By the second week of July, Caleb Drum was arriving at the cabin before Maren was fully awake, starting the morning fire before she came out, checking the fish racks before she'd assessed them. She didn't comment on this development. She simply began leaving the gate unlatched. The work between them organized itself without much discussion. He was strong and had the physical intelligence of someone who'd been doing hard labor since childhood. He figured out the mechanics of a new task, quickly adjusted when something wasn't working. Didn't need to be told the same thing twice. Marin was precise in a way that came from having thought hard about every step of every process. Together they moved faster than either would have alone, and the yard began to take on a complexity that even Marin hadn't fully imagined when the summer started. She built a second drying structure on the south-facing slope below the cabin, a long, low frame with a roof of angled glass salvaged from two broken windows, creating a solar tunnel that heated the air inside to temperatures well above ambient, even on overcast days. Caleb dug the drainage channels around it so rain wouldn't pool beneath the wooden base. She taught him to cure meat in salt brine before smoking, which kept it from going rank in the first few weeks of storage. He figured out on his own that if you hung the smoke strips with the cut end down, rather than across the fat rendered more evenly as it dried. She started noticing that he watched her the way she'd once watched the books she'd sent for from Denver, not passively, but converting what he saw into something he could use. It reminded her in a way she didn't examine too closely of the older of her two boys. Peter had that quality, the capacity for serious attention. She did not tell Caleb this. The day Reverend Crane came up the ridge was a Tuesday in mid-July, hot enough that the air above the drying racks shimmered slightly. He arrived on foot, hat in hand, moving with the careful dignity of a man who's come to do something uncomfortable and has decided to do it gracefully. He was not an unkind man, Aldous Crane. He had a long face, sympathetic eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the voice of someone who had delivered both comfort and hard news so many times that the two had become indistinguishable in his register. Marin saw him coming up the trail and kept working. He sat in the chair she kept near the cabin door for visitors she couldn't turn away without causing more trouble than it was worth. She poured coffee without being asked. He accepted it with both hands. He spoke about the community's concern about how it troubled him to see a member of his congregation working herself to exhaustion, about how the Lord provided for those who trusted in him, about how isolation wasn't the answer to grief. He said all of this with genuine care, and Marin listened to all of it, and then she set her own coffee cup down on the table between them. 3 weeks, she said. That's how long we were sealed in during the winter of '83. 3 weeks with half a sack of oats and no meat and no wood to speak of. I prayed every one of those days, Reverend. I want you to know that. I prayed with everything I had. She paused. Praying was the only thing I had to do because I hadn't done anything else. I hadn't prepared. I had trusted that things would be provided, and I knelt in the cold next to my boys, and I prayed, and Lars was dead by Thursday. She picked up her coffee again. I have a great deal of respect for the Lord's will, but I have no intention of requiring a miracle when hard work in June would do the same job. The Reverend left shortly after. He was not angry she'd read him right in that respect. He was something closer to humbled, which was a different thing entirely, and harder in some ways to sit with. She never knew exactly what he said to the town after that visit. Whatever it was, the quality of the talk about her shifted slightly. The laughter became less certain at the edges, the jokes a degree shorter. Caleb had heard the exchange from behind the cabin where he'd been splitting kindling. He didn't bring it up until the end of the day, when they were both sitting on the porch steps in the low evening light, too tired for conversation, but not yet ready to call the day finished. Did you mean what you said to him? His voice was careful the way it got when he was asking something he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Marin looked out across the ridge toward the mountains in the west, where the last of the sun was pulling the color out of the sky in long horizontal stripes. Every word. About praying. About all of it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. My mother prayed right up until the end. I used to sit next to her and listen. Marin didn't respond to this because there was nothing to say to it that wouldn't be inadequate. Instead, she stood, brushed the sawdust from her skirt, and went inside to check the evening fire. After a moment, she heard him get up and follow because there was still the morning wood to stack before dark. Silas Pruitt arrived in Harlow Flat on a Wednesday in the second week of August, which was unusual. His circuit normally brought him through in late September, when the ranchers had money from the summer drives and were inclined to spend some of it on books and news from outside the valley. Coming through in August meant something had changed in his itinerary, and in Silas Pruitt's carefully organized life, changes in itinerary were always deliberate. He was 68 years old, built like a fence post that had been standing in the wind for decades. Thin, slightly bowed, but with no apparent intention of falling. He'd been a schoolteacher in Illinois before a combination of bad land deals and worse winters had sent him west, and he'd been moving through the mountain communities as a traveling merchant ever since, carrying books and periodicals and the kind of information that didn't make it into newspapers because it was too specific or too local or too strange for editors who lived in cities. Marin came down to Gideon's that Wednesday because she'd been waiting for beeswax and it had come in with a supply wagon. She wasn't expecting to find Silas Pruitt's mule tied out front or to find the man himself inside talking to Walt Gideon in the low, serious tone that people use when they're saying something they want to be taken seriously. She heard the tail end of it as she came through the door. "Not saying it's certain. I'm saying the indicators I saw in Wyoming last month were consistent with what I saw in the winter of '71. The frost patterns, the early animal movement. I talked to a Crow elder near Billings who said his people hadn't seen the elk move this early in 20 years. Walt Gideon noticed Marin first. Something in his expression shifted, a fractional recalibration, the look of a man who's suddenly aware that the most relevant audience for a conversation has just walked in. Silas turned. He'd met Marin twice before, briefly, the way people meet briefly in small communities, enough for mutual recognition, not enough for more. He took in the flour sack she was carrying, the general quality of alert attention in her posture, and made the same assessment of her that she was making of him. Miss Voss. He was one of the few people in the valley who had never called her the widow. "Mr. Pruitt." She set the flour sack on the counter. "I heard the last part of that. The winter of '71, you mean the one that took the cattle herds in eastern Montana?" "Same pattern." He studied her. "Most people change the subject when I bring that up. Most people didn't spend 3 weeks eating boiled leather in 1883. She looked at Walt Gideon. "I'll take the beeswax, Walt. Whatever Mr. Pruitt has left in his wagon, I'll take that too." Gideon blinked. "He's got quite a bit, Marin. Tools, ropes, some canned goods, 2 more salt sacks. Whatever he has left." She turned back to Pruitt. "After we settle on a price, I'd like you to come up to the ridge and tell me everything you saw in Wyoming. The specific details. The frost patterns, where you saw them, what date. The animal movement, species, direction, timing. I want the numbers if you have numbers." Silas Pruitt looked at her for a long moment with an expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, but had elements of both. "I have notes," he said. "I keep notes on everything." "Then bring your notes." She spent 2 hours with him that afternoon, sitting at her outdoor table, while Caleb worked the evening fish run down at the creek. Pruitt's notes were meticulous columns of dates and observations in a cramped, even hand covering 12 pages of a leather-bound field book. He showed her the temperature readings he'd taken at night in Wyoming during the second week of July. Readings that should have been in the high 40s had been dropping into the mid-20s. He showed her observations of pronghorn moving east 2 weeks ahead of their normal pattern of bears feeding, with an urgency he described as compulsive rather than opportunistic. He showed her a sketch of frost crystals he'd found on a creek stone in Laramie County on the 12th of August, a date when frost crystals had no business being on anything in Wyoming. She read everything twice. She asked questions. She asked follow-up questions to the questions. Pruitt answered all of them, and somewhere in the middle of the third hour, his expression completed its transition from polite engagement to something that looked very much like the intellectual pleasure of being genuinely interrogated by someone who understood what they were asking about. When he stood to leave in the long evening light, he paused at the gate. "Most people I've talked to, they either don't believe it or they don't know what to do with it. I stopped bringing it up in most places." Marin was already back at the table, making her own notes on a sheet of paper. "How long do you think we have? If the pattern holds to '71, the real cold hits late October, early November at the outside." She wrote something down, then looked up. "The pass road, Sorrel Pass. In '71, when did it close?" Pruitt calculated. "The first slide came down in late September. Road was fully impassable by mid-October." She looked at her notes. Then she looked up at the ridge behind her cabin, at the drying racks catching the last of the afternoon light, at the rows of sealed crocks visible through the cabin window, at the carefully organized stacks of wood already lining the north wall. She measured what she had against what she now knew was coming, and the calculation was stark. She was not ready, not nearly ready enough. "Thank you," she said to Silas Pruitt, "for coming early, for keeping notes." He nodded, picked up his hat. You're the only person I've talked to all summer who didn't tell me I was being an old fool. She didn't watch him go. She was already calculating what else she needed and how many weeks she had left to get it. The next morning, she woke Caleb before dawn. He appeared in the cabin doorway, still pulling his shirt on, hair pushing up in three directions with the particular expression of someone who has been gotten up early enough that their face hasn't decided yet whether to be alarmed. Marin was already at the table with her list. "We're 2 months behind where we need to be," she said. He sat down across from her, rubbing his face with both hands. Behind on what? She pushed the paper across the table. He looked at it. She watched him read down the column, the quantities, the categories, the timelines she'd mapped against Pruitt's data. She saw the moment he understood what he was looking at. "This is a lot." His voice was even, not panicked, which confirmed the judgment she'd been forming about him for 6 weeks. "It is. We'd have to work every available daylight hour." "We would." He looked up from the paper. "Okay." He stood tucked in his shirt, picked up the paper, and walked to the door to look at the sky. Clear, warming fast, a good drying day. "I'll start with the second smoke rack. You mentioned the frame needed reinforcing before we hung more weight on it." She'd mentioned it once in passing 2 weeks earlier. She looked at him for a moment with something she didn't let reach her face. "Start with the smoke rack," she confirmed. What followed was 6 weeks of the most sustained work Marin had done since the winter of 1883, and that was work of a different kind entirely. The frantic, reactive work of someone trying to survive what was already upon them. This was different. This was building against a future she could see clearly, even if no one else could, and the clarity of it made the exhaustion feel purposeful, in a way that was, if not exactly pleasurable, then at least clean. They fished the creek every morning before breakfast, taking everything the water would give them. Marin had devised a system, small fish salted and whole-dried larger fish filleted and smoked in the new rack Caleb had reinforced with iron braces salvaged from a broken wagon wheel. She found she could judge a fish's cure by the weight of it. In her hand, a correctly dried strip had a specific resistance, a slight give at the center that told you the moisture had come down to the right level without going so far that the flesh went brittle and began to crack. Caleb learned this too within the first week. She noticed that he'd started touching the strips as he hung them, not randomly, but deliberately, comparing one to another, building the calibration in his fingers. She didn't comment on it. Learning that happened without comment tended to stick better than learning that was praised. The garden gave its last push in August summer, squashed the remaining tomatoes, the beans that had been climbing the south fence all season. Marin sliced and dried and pickled with an efficiency that left almost nothing to waste. The tomato skins that came off during blanching were dried separately and ground to powder for flavoring broth in winter. Bean pods that were past their peak for eating were shelled, and the dried beans stored in sealed crocks with a layer of salt on top. She found she was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night instead of her usual 6, not because she was anxious, but because the day simply didn't have enough room for everything that needed to be done. She also wrote a letter to the woman in Nebraska, the one she'd been corresponding with for 2 years, describing what Pruitt had told her and asking specifically about how the woman had managed her water supply when the creek had frozen solid in the winter of 1880. The reply came back 2 weeks later, 3 pages of dense practical information that Marin read twice and then tucked into the ledger where she kept her most important documents. September came in warm enough that the valley relaxed. The rains that everyone expected in the last week of the month were 5 days late, which made people feel better about everything, the way a slight delay always does. The brain translating coincidence into reprieve, chance into reassurance. Marin watched the sky. The rains, when they finally came on the 4th of October, came wrong. Not the gentle soaking rains that the mountain country expected in early fall, settling into the soil, filling the creek at a pace the drainage could manage. These came fast, hard, and continuous, the kind of rain that the land had no framework for processing, that ran off the slopes in sheets instead of seeping in, gathering in the creek beds and draws, and pushing them past their margins within 24 hours. Marin heard the first rumor about Sorrel Pass on the 6th of October from the Gerhardt boys who brought it up the ridge, not laughing now, moving with the specific efficiency of young men who've received bad news and are too proud to show how much it's affected them. A section of the pass road had given way. Not completely, they said. Wagons could still get through if they were careful. She received this information, thanked them, closed the gate behind them. She looked at Caleb, who was standing by the woodstack with an armload of split pine. He looked back at her. "How much salt do we have left?" he asked. 40 pounds. He set the wood down. "I'll go to Gideon's in the morning. Buy everything he has of it." She thought for a moment. "Buy the rope too. All of it. Any dried beans he hasn't sold." The look on Walt Gideon's face when Caleb arrived the next morning, she heard about it from Caleb that evening, was not quite panic. It was the expression of a man who keeps careful track of inventory and has just realized in the presence of someone else's preparedness that he has been complacent in a way that matters. He sold Caleb everything he asked for without argument, which was itself a kind of answer to any question anyone might have been asking about how seriously Walt Gideon was now taking the state of Sorrel Pass. The second slide came down on the 12th of October. Marin heard it from the ridge, a distant, sustained sound like a river running underground, then a silence that was different from ordinary silence, denser, more absolute. She climbed to the highest point of the ridge and looked south toward the pass. Through the gray air, she could see the altered profile of the slope above the road. A section that had been pine-covered and vertical was now a sloping field of raw earth and debris, and at its base, invisible from here, but present in her understanding of the terrain, lay what remained of the only road in or out of Harlow Flat. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the cold coming down off the mountain to work its way through her coat, long enough to watch the way the clouds were moving across the peaks to the northwest, not fast, not dramatic, but with the patient, purposeful movement of something that has a destination and no uncertainty about reaching it. She thought about Eric briefly, not the way she usually kept that thought compressed and sealed and stored in a place she didn't open during working hours. She let it exist for a moment in the open air. The thin chain at her collar held his wedding ring too large for her finger to wear safely at the work she did, but present against her sternum, where she could feel its weight when she breathed. She thought about the 3 small graves behind the cabin and the distance between who she'd been then and who she was now. Preparation was not the same thing as grief. It was something she'd built on top of grief, or maybe she'd built it inside grief. Used grief as the foundation, the way you use bedrock for a structure you need to trust with your life. She could not bring back the 3 people she'd failed to save. What she could do was refuse to need saving herself. What she could do was refuse to be the reason anyone else needed saving. She came down off the ridge as the last light left the sky. Caleb was at the outdoor table checking the wax seals on the season's last batch of preserved tomatoes, pressing each lid with his thumb to test the vacuum. He looked up when she came through the gate. He read her face the way he'd learned to read the drying racks, not passively, but extracting. "It's bad," she said. "Not a question. The full road. What I could see of it, yes." She sat down across from him. "Walt Gideon put a notice on the post office door this afternoon. Road washed out. Last delivery unknown." Caleb pressed another lid. The vacuum held. He set the jar in the row with the others. "How long will what we have last?" Marin had done this calculation already twice with different assumptions about portion sizes and caloric need. For one person in good storage conditions through April, possibly May if the spring comes early. She looked at the rows of sealed crocks, the stacked provisions, the hanging racks, the root cellar she'd measured and packed and measured again. For 2 through March. He understood what she was saying. She saw him understand it. "That's just us," he said. "That's just us." She looked toward the valley below, where the lights of Harlow Flat were beginning to appear one by one in the blue dusk. Each one the visible evidence of a household that had spent the summer the way summers usually got spent in places like this, doing what needed doing in the present, trusting that supply wagons would keep coming the way they always had, trusting that the pass road would stay open the way it always had, trusting that the almanac was probably right when it said the winter would be average. The almanac had been printed in St. Louis. The man who compiled it had never been to Cinder Notch Ridge. He had never watched the way the elk moved through this particular valley in a year when the pressure was dropping wrong. He had never talked to Silas Pruitt or to the Crow elder near Billings, or to a woman in Nebraska who'd spent the winter of 1880 eating bark broth and writing it all down so that someone somewhere might learn from it. The lights in Harlow Flat glowed warm and steady in the gathering dark, and looking at them now from this elevation, Marin felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not fear exactly, which had a specific and recognizable quality she'd lived inside for too long, but something adjacent to it. Something that had weight and consequence, that pressed against the chest from the inside. She looked at those lights a long time. Then she stood, pulled her coat tighter, and went inside to check the evening fire. In the morning, she said as she reached the door, "We check every seal on every jar, every one. We can't afford to find out in January that something didn't hold." Caleb started gathering the last of the outdoor crocks to bring in before the temperature dropped. And after, she paused at the threshold, looking out at the sky to the northwest, where the clouds were building in a darkness that had nothing to do with the hour. After, she said, "We figure out what we're missing, because we're still missing something. We always are." She went inside. The fire was burning low but steady, the way a fire burns when someone's been tending it carefully all season. Not spectacular, not wasteful, just present. Just exactly what it needed to be. Outside, the first wind of the evening came down off the mountain, moving through the drying racks with a sound like breath, like something enormous settling in for a long stay. The apple slices swayed on their strings. The sealed crocks caught the last of the light. The three graves behind the cabin were invisible in the dark, but Marin knew exactly where they were, the way you always know exactly where the things are that you can't afford to forget. She didn't look. She added wood to the fire, checked the damper, listened to the wind, find the corners of the cabin, and test them. Tomorrow would need to be a very productive day. The snow came without ceremony. No gradual buildup, no days of gray sky, easing the valley toward what was coming. On the 3rd of November, Harlow Flat went to bed under a cold but ordinary sky, the kind that had been hanging over Montana for 2 weeks without committing to anything. By the time the first household stirred before dawn, on the fourth 5 feet of snow had reorganized the entire world. Fences had become suggestions. The road through town existed only as a slight depression between two white walls. The livery roof had partially collapsed under the weight, killing 2 horses before anyone knew it had happened. Marin was already awake when it came. She'd been awake most of the night, listening to the change in the wind that happened around 2 in the morning, a shift from the northwest to due north, the temperature dropping through the floor of whatever the thermometer had been measuring. She'd added wood to the fire every 40 minutes with the regularity of someone who has decided that running out of heat is not a category of experience she is willing to revisit. When she finally opened the door at first light and saw what had happened to the world outside, her first thought was not fear. It was arithmetic. She did the calculation in her head in the time it took her to exhale one breath in the cold air, watching it plume white against the white of everything else. Caleb appeared behind her, pulling suspenders over his shoulders, and looked out over her shoulder at the altered landscape. His voice was very quiet. "That's early." 3 weeks early. She stepped back inside, picked up her notebook from the shelf, opened it to the page where she'd written Pruitt's timeline. She looked at the date she'd circled in October, then at the calendar on the wall. She closed the notebook. Start with the woodpile. Check how much is accessible under the snow. Then check the smoke racks if any of the frames shifted under that weight. I need to know before we load them again. He was already putting on his coat. The news from town came up the ridge in pieces over the following 2 days, carried by anyone willing to make the climb. 2 infants in separate households had not survived the first night their families had been burning furniture by midnight, when the wood ran out the drafty construction of their cabins, no match for what the temperature had become. A fire started by the Aldrich family, who'd been heating stones on a cook stove, in a way the stove wasn't built for, had taken their cabin, and both people inside it, before anyone close enough to help could get through the snow in time. Reverend Crane organized what remained of his congregation into a recovery effort, but the recovery was largely the work of bearing witness, because there wasn't much left to recover. What filtered up to Marin's Ridge was the shift in the quality of sound from below. Harlow Flat had always had a specific auditory texture. The ordinary percussion of a working community hammer strikes hoarse sounds, voices carrying across the flat in the particular way voices carry in mountain air. What replaced it in those first days of November was a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of people conserving, holding still, measuring what they had against how long they'd need it to last, arriving at numbers they didn't like. The first knock on Marin's door came on the 7th of November, shortly after noon. She was expecting it. Not the specific person, but the fact of it. She'd been watching the trail up the ridge from the cabin window on a rotation she didn't fully acknowledge to herself, checking it at intervals, the way you check a wound. Not because you want bad news, but because knowing is always better than not knowing. Caleb answered the door. She heard him inhale sharply before she saw why. Roy Drum stood on the porch in a coat that wasn't adequate for the temperature. She could see that from across the room, the way it hung on him, the wrong weight for what the air outside had become. His face was the particular gray of a man who's been cold for longer than the body adjusts to easily. He was alone, which meant Caleb was not with him, which meant Caleb had been here, and Roy had come up the ridge knowing that. What happened next moved through several registers simultaneously. Roy Drum's right hand was inside his coat pocket, and the shape his arm made wasn't casual. Caleb had moved to stand between his father and Marin without quite seeming to decide to do it the way the body sometimes acts ahead of the mind. Roy's eyes went from his son to the woman behind him, then back to his son, with an expression Marin had seen on men before, the specific brittle pride of someone who has run out of most things, including options, and is down to posture. Caleb's voice when he spoke had the levelness of someone much older. "Put it away, Pa." Roy's jaw moved. Whatever he'd meant to say when he climbed the ridge rearranged itself in the cold air. "You come home." "I am home." The steadiness in Caleb didn't waver. "You put that away and you come inside, or you turn around. Those are the choices." The moment held. Marin remained where she was, her hands visible at her sides, her weight balanced forward, not threatening but present in the way that a load-bearing wall is present. Roy Drum looked at his son for a long time, the kind of looking that holds years of failure in it, the accumulated weight of a man who watched himself become someone he hadn't planned to be. Something in his face moved like ice shifting on a river when the temperature finally tips. His hand came out of his pocket empty. His shoulders went down. When he stepped through the door, he was crying silently the way men who haven't cried in a long time do it, without any of the mechanics of crying, just the tears. Caleb put one hand briefly on his father's shoulder, then moved away to give him the dignity of not being watched. Marin set a cup of broth on the table. "Sit down," she said. "There's a condition. One condition, non-negotiable. You don't drink here. Not a drop, not once, not for any reason. If you agree to that, you stay and you work." She waited. "If you don't agree to it, I'll give you enough to get back down the ridge safely, and that's the end of it." Roy Drum looked at the broth. He looked at his son's back. "I agree," he said, the words worn down to their simplest shape. She took him at his word because the alternative, not taking anyone at their word, made a kind of arithmetic that didn't add up to anything she wanted to build. 3 days after Roy arrived, 3 families came up the ridge together as if there were safety in the number. The Langfords, the Marshes, the Aldriches, who'd lost their cabin to the fire, 8 people total, 4 of them children. They came without gifts, without weapons, without performance. They came with hollow faces and children who'd stopped making the noise children usually make, which was its own kind of emergency signal. Marin stood at the gate and looked at them. She knew all of them. She knew which of the men had laughed at the Gerhardt boys' jokes about her summer work. She knew which of the women had murmured to each other at church about grief taking people peculiarly. She held none of this against them now, not because she'd forgotten it, but because holding it served no function she cared about. She was not in the business of being right. She was in the business of staying alive, and aliveness, she had learned, was not a solo enterprise when the temperature dropped far enough for long enough. But she was also not running a charity because charity ran out and what she was building had to last. She made them stand in the cold for the 2 minutes it took her to say what needed saying. The conditions were simple work, no theft, no demands. She didn't negotiate the terms. She didn't soften them. People who had choices could afford to negotiate. People who had none could afford honesty. When she was done, all 8 of them came through the gate because they had no other gate to come through. The cabin expanded itself through will and necessity. Caleb built a second sleeping area from pine boards and salvaged nails in the back room, just wide enough for bodies laid side by side. Roy Drum, who had once been good with his hands before whiskey, narrowed his attention to a single point, rediscovered that skill, with a sobriety that had its own momentum each day, sober feeding the next, in the way that only becomes clear once you're a week into it. He built a narrow shelf system along the north wall for the children's bedding, keeping them off the floor where the cold came up through the boards in the deep hours of the night. Nobody asked him to do it. He just appeared one morning with the lumber. The cabin now held 14 people. It was loud in ways Marin hadn't experienced in 3 years, full of the specific noise of people living in close quarters, the small frictions, the sounds of sleep that weren't her own, the voices of children negotiating territory with the instinctive seriousness of diplomats. She absorbed all of it. She ran the household the way she ran her food stores, with precision, without waste, attending to each element, with the knowledge that overlooking the small things was how the large things failed. Ren Neal arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of November. She was not carried, not unconscious, not in visible distress. She came through the front gate on her own feet, with her hand in her father's, and a cloth doll tucked under her arm. 6 years old, with the slightly formal posture of a child who has decided to conduct herself with dignity in a situation she doesn't fully understand. Franklin Neal was a mill hand, or had been before the mill stopped running in October when its wheel froze solid. He was a narrow man with an honest face that was currently doing the work of carrying something too heavy for its structure. He'd lost his wife the previous year in childbirth, which meant Ren was everything he had, which meant what he was about to do was the most costly thing he had done in his life. He stood at the door and looked at Marin, and she saw that he wasn't going to be able to say what he needed to say more than once. His voice, when it came, had the texture of something that had been compressed past the point of normal speech. "She hasn't eaten properly in 3 days. I know what the cough means. I don't have anything left. I can't." He stopped, started again. "She told me she can sweep good. I believe her." Ren looked up at Marin with eyes that were gray and clear and very serious. "I don't cry at night." Her voice was precise about this, as if it were a professional qualification. "I know that's important when there are lots of people." Marin looked at the child for a long moment. She opened the door wider. Franklin Neal crouched down and pressed his face against his daughter's hair for a few seconds, then stood, kissed her forehead, and turned away into the snow without looking back. Marin watched him go. She did not close the door until he had disappeared below the ridgeline, so that if he turned, he would have seen the light still open behind his daughter. Ren stepped inside, looked around at the organized, humming interior of the cabin with the evaluative attention of someone taking inventory, then set her doll on the shelf nearest the door and found a broom in the corner before anyone told her where it was. By the time December arrived, Orrin Bale had been circling the cabin for 3 days. Caleb found the tracks first on a morning when the fog had come down thick enough to make the tree line invisible from the porch. 4 sets of prints moving in a wide arc around the cabin's perimeter, not approaching the door, not retreating entirely, the pattern of people conducting surveillance or of people working up to something. Caleb didn't say anything to the children. He came inside, pulled Marin aside, showed her the sketch he'd made on a scrap of paper, the track pattern, the estimated boot size, the depth of the impression indicating body weight. She looked at the sketch. She looked at Caleb. "I know whose those are," she said. She'd known Orrin Bale for years, the way you know people in small communities well enough to understand his outline, the shape of what he was capable of. He was a man whose competence had always been physical, which had served him well when the valley was flush, and became something else entirely when it wasn't. She'd heard through the fractured information network that still functioned in Harlow Flat that Bale had lost his winter stores to a burst pipe and hadn't had the architecture of preparation to rebuild them. That night she didn't sleep. She sat near the cabin's small front window with the lamp turned down and waited. Caleb sat across from her. They didn't talk. The children slept. Roy Drum's breathing from the back room was steady, and even the sound of a man who hadn't slept this well or this sober in 2 years. Bale came out of the dark at the edge of the clearing just after what Marin judged to be 2 a.m. 3 figures resolving out of the black between the trees with the specific hesitation of men who've made a decision in the warmth but are now executing it in the cold, and the cold is making them reconsider. She was out the door before they'd crossed half the clearing, her rifle easy on her shoulder, her breath coming out white in the dark. She stopped at the porch edge and let them come to her because making them cover ground put the psychological weight where she wanted it. Bale stopped 10 feet out. He was a large man, thick through the chest, but the cold had worked on him, and so had hunger, and the combination had reduced him in ways that were visible even in the dark. The 2 men with him stopped when he stopped, which told her they were following his lead, which told her if his lead faltered, they'd falter with it. His voice had the forced lightness of someone performing a confidence he wasn't feeling. "Heard you've got half a trading post up here, Marin. Heard you're feeding those kids like it's Sunday dinner. They work. Her voice was level as a shelf. We ain't here to work. His weight shifted. We're past that kind of evening. Then you're past eating here. She didn't raise the rifle. She didn't need to. Its presence on her shoulder was a complete sentence. Turn around, Oren. Take your men back down the ridge. This doesn't have to be something you don't come back from. The pause that followed had texture in it. She could feel the calculation happening, the weighing of options against odds, the cold working on resolve the way cold always does. Then the door behind her opened just a crack, and Ren Neal's small face appeared in the gap, 6 years old, holding her broom upright, with both hands entirely composed, as if she'd simply come outside to assess what needed sweeping. The effect on Bale was something Marin couldn't have engineered deliberately. The sight of a child that small, that unbothered in the doorway of a cabin where there was warmth, did something to the geography of the confrontation that couldn't be argued with. The calculation that had been happening behind Bale's eyes completed itself and came out on a different side than the one he'd started on. He spat in the snow, turned, and walked back toward the trees. The two men went with him. The dark took them. Marin stood on the porch until the trees gave nothing back, then turned around. Ren looked up at her without any particular triumph in her expression. I heard a noise, Ren said simply, and went back inside. Caleb was standing just inside the door with a hatchet he'd picked up at some point during the preceding minutes. He looked at Marin. She looked at the hatchet. He set it down. Tomorrow, she said, we reinforce the gate. The fog came down in the second week of January and didn't lift for 4 days. It was a different kind of cold than what had come before. Not the sharp cold of moving air and hard frost, but something dense still that wrapped around the cabin and pressed against the windows from outside, muffling every sound until voices carried only as far as the next person. The creek below the ridge, which had been speaking in a low, frozen murmur since December, went fully silent. Even the trees stopped moving, as if they'd decided that movement cost more than they had left to spend. On the second day of the fog, Caleb saw the shape. He was checking the near woodpile when it appeared at the tree line, a form that resolved slowly out of the white into something human, moving with the loose, interrupted gait of a body that was operating on reserve. It was small, which was the first thing he registered, small enough that his mind sorted it into the child category before the details confirmed it. The boy was maybe 8, barefoot, despite everything wrapped in burlap sacking, with a length of rope around his waist as a belt. His eyelashes were white with ice crystals. He made it to within 20 feet of the porch before his legs stopped cooperating. Caleb caught him before he reached the ground. They stripped the burlap off him inside, got dry wool around him, began the careful work of bringing someone back from the threshold, not too fast. Never too fast, because the body in that state doesn't respond well to shock in either direction. Marin fed him broth with a spoon in small increments, while his color moved from the wrong shades towards something that suggested his body still had interest in continuing. It took 2 hours. When he finally opened his eyes with something in them beyond blank endurance, he looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Marin, then said with the flat factual tone of someone reporting on weather, "The roof fell in. My brother and my ma were under it." The cabin was very quiet. Marin kept her voice even. "What's your name, Eli?" He seemed to consider whether there was more. "Eli Calder." She looked at Caleb over the boy's head. He held her gaze for a moment, then stood and went to put on his coat. She didn't stop him. He took the sled from behind the cabin and went down the ridge into the fog, and he was gone for 2 hours, and when he came back empty-handed in the way that confirmed what the boy had already told him, and he stood by the door for a minute before he came inside and didn't speak about it to anyone. Owen Marsh was 9 years old, the son of the Marsh couple who'd come up the ridge in November. He was a quiet child, serious in the manner of children who've learned that serious behavior draws less unwanted attention than expressive behavior. He'd been useful in the cabin through December, in small ways keeping Eli Calder company in the evenings, carrying wood bundles that were almost too heavy for him, without complaint taking directions from Caleb, with the earnest precision of someone who understood that directions existed for reasons. In the third week of January, Caleb took Owen and another boy, 12-year-old Jeb Langford, to check the traps he'd set in the timber on the east side of the ridge. It was a clear morning, the fog finally gone, the temperature risen to something that still required every layer you owned, but no longer punished you for moving through it. The trap line was less than a mile from the cabin along a route Caleb had walked a dozen times. The shot came from the trees on the north side of the trail. One shot. Caleb felt the air of it. Owen Marsh was on his left, slightly behind, and then Owen was on the ground, and Caleb was kneeling over him, his hands trying to find the location of the damage, while his mind ran the calculations you run when you're 17, and someone has just made a decision with a trigger that you now have to live inside. He got Owen back to the cabin. It took 40 minutes that felt like something longer than time normally contains. He did not let himself think because thinking would have required acknowledging what his hands were already telling him, and he needed his hands to keep working. Owen Marsh died in Caleb's arms 20 minutes after they came through the door. He was 9 years old. The cabin absorbed this the way a structure absorbs stress. The load distributed, each person finding their own way to carry a portion of it, none of it evenly divided. None of it made lighter by the distribution. Owen's parents made sounds for a period that were not words. The other children were very still. Wren sat in the corner with her doll and said nothing for several hours, the longest Maren had ever known her to be quiet. Maren sat through that night without sleeping, the rifle across her thighs. The fire built up past its usual evening level because she needed light as well as heat. Needed to see the room clearly, needed the visible evidence of everyone still breathing. She didn't cry. Not because she had no grief, she had a grief that sat on her chest like fieldstone, specific in its weight, but because crying would have required her to be somewhere other than where she was, and where she was had to be enough. It was Wren who came into her past midnight, stepping around the sleeping bodies with the careful navigation of someone much older. She sat beside Maren without asking, pulled her doll to her chest, looked at the fire. After a while, in her practical, direct way, "What do we do now?" Maren looked at the fire. The flames were doing what flames do, consuming, converting, giving off heat as a byproduct of their own disappearance. She thought about what she was made of and what it had cost to build it. "We remember him," she said. "We stay." The morning after they buried Owen in the frozen ground behind the cabin, the first grave back there that didn't belong to a Voss, Maren went through the food inventory with the precision she brought to everything, measuring what remained against the number of mouths, against the minimum necessary daily intake. She had enough. Enough was the only number that mattered, and she had it, but the margin between enough and not enough had become a number she had to look at directly every single day. What happened with Dex Holt was harder than Bale because it was harder in a different way. Holt arrived alone on a morning in late January when the temperature had come up slightly enough that the cold was merely brutal rather than lethal. He'd been before the autumn the wealthiest man in Harlow Flat, 2,000 acres on the valley floor, a herd that had made him comfortable, a large house with glass windows on all four sides. He'd also been the loudest. She could still recall the specific quality of his laughter from the road below the ridge in July, when word had spread about how much salt she was buying. He stood at her gate now in a coat that had once been fine, and was now several things at once, weathered too large for the frame wearing it, an accurate record of what the last 3 months had cost him. His hands were in his pockets. He had nothing to offer, no child to deliver, no labor history to present as credential. He was simply a man who had reached the end of what his own preparation could sustain, which was earlier than most because he had prepared less than most, and what he'd spent before the 1st of December on the assumption that the supply wagons would come. He didn't ask to come in. He stood at the gate and looked at her with the specific dignity of a man who has decided that whatever pride he has left will go toward not begging. Maren stood on her side of the gate. Inside the cabin, 14 people were beginning the morning's work, and she was aware of every one of them, aware of the food she'd counted that morning, aware of where the numbers landed. She had no strategic reason to let him in. He was not a child. He was not someone with nowhere else to go. He was the man who had laughed loudest, who had had the most, who had prepared the least because comfort had convinced him that preparation was for people who didn't have his resources. She was under no obligation to him. She could give him enough to make the ridge descent safely and close the gate. She stood there in the cold and looked at him, and she did not look at the man he'd been. She looked at the man in front of her, thin, upright, silent, asking nothing with his mouth. "You know how to split wood?" Her voice gave nothing. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite hope because it was too careful for hope. "Not well. You'll learn." She unlatched the gate. "One condition, same as everyone. You work, you don't steal, you don't demand. You break any part of that, you go back down. The split wood is behind the north wall. Caleb will show you the weight. Dex Holt walked through the gate. He didn't thank her. She didn't want him to. Thanks would have required her to receive something from him, which would have created a relationship she had no interest in navigating. What she'd offered wasn't forgiveness. It was a transaction the same as she'd offered everyone else. And she held to the symmetry of that because the day she started making exceptions based on what people deserved was the day the whole system bent out of true. He split wood that afternoon with the concentration of someone learning to read for the first time, slow, effortful, occasionally wrong in ways that cost him splinters. He didn't complain. His hands were bleeding by midday. He wrapped them in cloth strips from the rag bin and continued. Roy Drum showed him the correct stance for the axe without being asked to. Neither of them mentioned that they'd been neighbors for 15 years and hadn't spoken much before this. By the end of January, Marin's stores had come down from abundance to sufficiency to something she could only describe to herself as careful precision. She did the daily count the way a surgeon counts instruments, not from anxiety, but from the knowledge that precision was the only thing standing between the number of people in her cabin and a different kind of morning than the one they were currently capable of having. She stretched the broth by boiling bones twice. She taught the children to shave dried beet into stew in slivers too thin to be bitter, which added both color and nutrient and made the stew look more substantial than it was, which mattered in a way that was partly practical. People ate better when their eyes confirmed there was something to eat. She began the work of teaching them to preserve in winter using the south porch and angled mirrors she'd salvaged from a broken vanity heating stones in the fire all morning, and using them in wooden boxes with stitched glass lids to dry the scarce scraps they could accumulate. "We plan now," she told them one evening, her voice carrying through the cabin to everyone awake enough to hear it so we don't die later. None of the children laughed. None of them had laughed in a way that cost anything, since Owen Marsh and what had replaced it wasn't grief exactly, but a seriousness that sat on even the youngest faces like weather. Wren Neal at 6 had the eyes of someone who had revised her understanding of what the world contained and was in the process of deciding what to do with the revised version. In early February, Roy Drum disappeared before dawn. Caleb found the empty spot beside the wood stove where Roy had been sleeping, found the coat gone from the hook, found the door unlatched. He came to Marin with the expression of someone managing a fear they aren't going to let run loose. She looked at the door at the dark outside at the temperature the morning was offering. There was nothing to do but wait. Roy Drum came back 4 hours later with a deer across his shoulders, a doe thin from winter, foraging, but substantial, carrying more protein than anything Marin had in the cabin at that moment. He also had 2 old traps he dug out of the ruins of Gideon's trading post, which had been partially collapsed by snow since December. He set the deer down at the cabin door and looked at his son. Caleb looked back. He crossed the distance between them and put his hand on his father's arm briefly. Not an embrace exactly, but the acknowledgement of something. Roy Drum's face did something complicated and settled. No one made a speech about it. They dressed the deer that afternoon, and the smell of fresh meat in the cabin produced a quality of silence from the children that was different from the silences of grief or cold. It was anticipatory biological. The body's response to what it recognized as rescue, and it was the most hopeful sound Marin had heard in 3 months. Outside, somewhere below the ridge in the white and frozen stillness of a valley waiting to be released, something was coming. She could feel it the way she'd always been able to feel the weather. Not mystically, not through any gift, but through attention, through the accumulated practice of watching everything closely enough that patterns became legible before they became obvious. But between now and whatever was coming, there was still February to get through, then March. There were still 18 people in a 2-room cabin. There were still the footprints she'd noticed circling the perimeter 3 nights ago, 4 sets unfamiliar with the particular pattern of weight distribution that told her they were carrying nothing. Not families, not fathers with daughters. Something that had been patient was running out of patience. She banked the fire for the night, checked the door, counted the heads in the sleeping room by the rise of breath visible in the cold air. 18. All there. She went to her chair by the window and sat down in the dark, with her rifle across her knees, watching the tree line, watching the snow, watching the particular quality of shadow that gathered at the edge of the clearing where the light from the cabin's banked fire didn't quite reach. She had not survived 3 years of silence on this ridge to lose anyone to carelessness now. The night was very long. She sat in it, patient as everything she'd built, and she watched. The letter from Eric was written on the back of a land survey form, dated November 1882, 14 months before he died. Marin had found it folded inside his boot after the thaw, where he'd apparently tucked it for safekeeping. During some task she couldn't reconstruct, preserved by the cold, the ink still clear. It listed in his careful, deliberate hand the quantities of food he believed a family of four needed to survive a Montana winter comfortably. Flour, salt, pork, dried beans, oats, lard. Numbers beside each one. A man planning ahead in the measured way of someone who expected to be alive to execute the plan. She'd kept it for 3 years in the ledger between the land deed and the territorial letter. She took it out sometimes, not often, not ritually, but in the moments when she needed to look at his handwriting rather than at the numbers themselves. His sevens had a particular hook at the top. She'd forgotten that until the first time she unfolded the paper. On the morning of the 3rd of February, she sat alone before the rest of the cabin, woke the fire low, the paper open on the table in front of her. She wasn't reading it. She was simply keeping it company in the dark, the way you sit with something that can't speak but carries weight. Outside, the temperature was doing what it had been doing for 2 weeks, sitting in a range that the thermometer registered, but the body had stopped being able to meaningfully distinguish from worse. Cold was cold past a certain point. The gradations stopped mattering. She folded the paper, put it back in the ledger, put the ledger on its shelf. She added wood to the fire. She began the morning count before anyone else was awake. Not of people, she did that by sound and breath, but of what remained in the stores. 2 crates. Not empty, not desperate, but reduced to a precision that required daily management rather than weekly approximation. Every jar counted now in the way that a surgeon's instruments count, each one with a specific purpose, none with a replacement available. Caleb appeared in the doorway an hour later, pulling on his coat, reading her face the way he'd learned to read weather. How much? Why, 3 weeks full rations, 4.5 if we reduce the evening portion by a third. She didn't look up from the inventory sheet. We reduce. He didn't argue. He went to start the outdoor fire for the morning broth. The 4 sets of footprints that had circled the cabin 3 nights running were gone by the 4th morning, replaced by nothing. No tracks indicating departure, just an absence where the pattern had been, as if the snow had absorbed them. This was not reassuring. In Marin's experience, people who stopped being visible didn't stop being present. They simply changed what they were doing. The man appeared at the edge of the clearing on the 7th of February, just past dawn, resolving out of the gray light between the pines with the slow deliberateness of someone who wants to be seen approaching rather than discovered close. He was alone. He carried nothing in his hands, which she verified before she moved, watching from the cabin window. For the full 30 seconds, it took him to cross half the distance to the clearing center before he stopped. He was not a man she recognized. Lean, weathered past, easy, aging, a scar that ran from the corner of his jaw toward his ear in the way that scars run when they've had years to settle into the skin. He stood in the open with his hands away from his body, not raised, not performative, just visible, and he called toward the cabin in a voice that carried the particular flatness of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and stripped it of everything except the necessary. Widow Crane. He used the wrong name, the name that had drifted up from Harlow Flat through some chain of telling and mishearing. I'm not here to fight. Marin came out with the rifle on her shoulder. She stopped at the porch edge. The distance between them was 30 feet, enough for conversation, not enough for surprise. He reached into his coat with 2 fingers slowly, the economy of movement that means you understand the situation clearly. He drew out a bundle of cloth and held it up with both hands. It was a child. Newborn or close to it, the bundle moving with the specific tremor of something alive, barely wrapped in what had once been a flannel shirt. The man held it at arm's length and slightly elevated, the way you hold an object you're offering, not a thing you're claiming. His voice didn't break, but it compressed the way a voice does when grief is being managed through deliberate control. Her mother died holding her outside Granger's barn 2 nights ago, froze with her arms around her. I found them in the morning. He paused. I'm not a good man. I won't tell you I am. But this child is not responsible for what I am. He set the bundle in the snow. He took 3 steps backward. He waited. 30 feet between them. The child visible in the snow, moving, the man's hands still away from his body. Marin looked at the scar on his jaw, at the quality of his eyes, not calculating, not watching for her guard to drop, but carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has already done the hardest thing they were going to do today, which was come here. She crossed the distance. She picked up the bundle. The child inside it was cold in a way that required immediate action, not contemplation, and she turned back toward the cabin without another word to the man. At the door, she paused, not looking back. There's a lean-to on the north side. Wood in it. You can get warm before you go back. When she looked out the window an hour later, the lean-to was empty. He'd taken nothing. She never saw him again. She didn't know his name or the child's or the mother's. Some things in that winter arrived without documentation and had to be held that way as facts without context, as weight without origin. The child was a girl. Wren named her within the first 20 minutes with the decisive authority she'd been exercising since the day she arrived. The name was Hazel because Wren explained of the color her eyes might be when they were done deciding. Marin didn't argue with this. Hazel was the 19th person in the cabin. She was also the most demanding per pound in ways that reorganized certain portions of the daily routine. Marin had raised 2 boys past infancy. The mechanics were not unfamiliar, though nothing in this particular winter was unexacting. The stores were now 19 mouths measured against what remained in 2 crates, and Marin did the calculation each evening with the same attention she'd given it every evening for 3 months, and the number continued to be enough, and enough continued to be the only number that mattered. Silas Pruitt arrived on the 16th of February. He came up the ridge on his knees. In the literal sense, his left leg had stopped functioning correctly somewhere below the knee, the result of a frostbite episode in December that had been managed but not resolved, and on the final slope of the ridge, the leg gave out entirely. Caleb found him 20 yards short of the gate, kneeling in the snow trying to stand with the methodical persistence of someone who hasn't yet decided to stop. He'd been in Harlow Flat through all of it. He'd survived in the basement of the schoolhouse after the building above him had become too cold for habitation, burning books for heat with the systematic practicality of a man working through a ranked list. He confirmed what she'd heard Dickens first, then the novels generally, then the histories, then the reference volumes in order of replaceability. He'd kept one thing, not the agricultural text she might have predicted, not a survival manual. He set it on her table that evening, a field notebook, his own bound in leather that had darkened with handling. He'd been keeping it since June. Every temperature reading he'd taken at night during his circuit through Wyoming, Colorado, the Montana passes. Every observation of animal behavior, every conversation with anyone who'd been watching the same things he'd been watching. Dates, locations, species, directions. 12 pages of data that constituted in aggregate the most accurate prediction of this winter's severity that anyone in the territory had produced. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, not from cold anymore, but from something else. The specific tremor of a man saying something that needed saying and had needed saying for a long time. I showed this to 4 people last summer, everyone I thought would listen. The storekeeper in Laramie, the territorial agent at the Billings Depot, 2 ranchers who had the resources to act on it. He looked at the pages. Not one of them asked a follow-up question. Marin looked at the notebook. She thought about Pruitt coming through Harlow Flat in August, about the conversation she'd had with him at the trading post, about buying everything in his wagon, while Walt Gideon watched with the expression of a man revising an estimate. She thought about what would have happened if he'd come through in June instead of August, what the valley might look like now. "You kept the notebook," she said. His voice was dry, careful. "I thought someone might eventually want it." She looked at him for a moment, then at the notebook, then back at him. "When your leg is better, you're going to write everything in this out in a form that children can be taught from. Every observation, every indicator, every date. You're going to make it a curriculum." Pruitt looked at her with the expression of a man who hadn't been given an assignment in 30 years, but found unexpectedly that he'd been waiting for one. He closed the notebook. "That will take some months." "We have months." She pushed back from the table. "You'll start when your leg lets you sit at a desk without it being punishment." March came in with a thaw that wasn't a thaw, a week of temperatures above freezing during the daylight hours that turned the snow to slush on south-facing slopes, raised everyone's spirits by a proportion. The actual change in conditions didn't warrant then, retreated by the second week back into temperatures that froze the surface slush into a crust hard enough to walk on, which was simultaneously useful for travel and deceptive about what lay underneath. Dex Holt's hands had fully calloused by March. The man who'd arrived in January unable to swing an axe without bleeding through the backstroke was now the cabin's primary wood splitter. Not through any natural gift, but through the specific transformation that repetitive hard labor produces in a body that isn't accustomed to it. The painful reconfiguration from soft to capable, the slow replacement of what had been soft with something that held. He didn't talk about it. He didn't talk much at all, which was perhaps the most dramatic change from the man who'd talked loudest in the valley. What he did instead was work with the sustained, undecorated focus of someone making a payment they understand will never fully settle the debt. Wren noticed him one afternoon standing at Owen Marsh's grave behind the cabin, the small grave with the twig cross near Marin's 3 stones. She didn't ask Holt what he was doing there. She stood beside him for a minute, then said with the direct, factual quality that was her most consistent characteristic, "He liked the way snow looks on pine branches. He told me that." Holt nodded. He crouched down in front of the grave marker without speaking, took his belt knife and carved a simple pattern into the wood at the base, a pine branch with snow settling on it, rough but legible. He stood, put the knife away, walked back to the woodpile. Wren watched him go and didn't tell anyone what she'd seen. Some things she'd learned were between the person who did them in the sky. The decision that cost Marin most came on a morning in late March, when one of the 4 circling shadows from February materialized at the gate in daylight alone. This time no theater, just a man standing outside a closed gate in cold that had become simply cold rather than lethal, which was its own form of progress. His name turned out to be Ira Hess. She knew his name because she'd known his brother who'd worked the Langford Ranch before everything changed. Ira had the quality of his brother's face at a different angle, hardened by what the winter had done to him. He didn't ask to come in. He stood at the gate and told her what he knew. The other 2 men from the group that had circled her cabin were dead. He named the location, a collapsed cabin a mile east where they'd been sheltering since December. He'd left that morning because staying was no longer the relevant option. He had nothing, no skills to offer that were obviously useful, no child, to leverage, no story that cast him as sympathetic. He was simply a man who had been part of a group that had frightened her children in December, and he was not asking her to forget that. Marin stood at the gate. Inside, she heard the sounds of morning work. Caleb directing the older children at the wood task, Roy Drum moving through the back room with the specific tread of a sober man who's grown comfortable in his own body again. Wren's voice reading something aloud to Hazel in the high, careful diction she'd developed for the baby. The gate had a latch. The latch could stay closed. She thought about what it meant to survive, specifically what the mechanism was. Not the canning or the smoking or the daily inventory, those were instruments. The mechanism was decisions made consistently in the direction of survival, even when the math of compassion made the arithmetic of survival tighter. She'd never made those decisions because they were easy. She'd made them because the alternative, a calculus of worthiness, of who deserved the gate opening, would have bent the whole structure out of true. You either believed that people could be more than what they'd been, or you were building something too small to outlast the winter. She opened the gate. "You know how to dress a deer." Ira Hess looked at her with an expression that contained too many things to catalog. "Yes. There's a doe Roy brought in yesterday. It needs finishing. You'll work with him in the afternoon." She stepped aside. "Same conditions as everyone. You break them, you go back to whatever's left at that cabin. You understand?" He came through the gate. He didn't thank her, which she respected. He went to find Roy Drum, and the 2 of them spent the afternoon at the deer, in a silence that had the quality of men who understand they've each been given something they didn't earn, working beside each other in the acknowledgement of that. The sound came on the 1st of April in the afternoon, while 3 of the children were outside, taking advantage of the strengthening sun. It came from south and below, distant, metallic, the kind of sound that travels differently from animal sounds or wind sounds, because it has intention in it. Wren heard it first. She stopped mid-step, head tilted, the specific posture of pure attention, then turned toward the cabin door and said with the economy of someone making a report, "Bell." It was not a church bell. It was smaller, more irregular, the bell on a mule's harness or on a sled rigged for distance travel. The sound that reaches a valley after 4 months of silence from the outside world. 2 men came into view at the far edge of the flat below the ridge, moving slowly, dragging a sled. Their clothing was destroyed in the specific way of people who've been moving through hard country for days, without adequate shelter, not dramatically tattered, but worn down to the functional minimum, every extra thing sacrificed to weight and warmth. One of them had his left arm in a rope sling. The other moved with the hitching gait of someone missing toes, but not willing to account for it. Behind them, at what felt like geological distance, but was actually 20 minutes of watching, the second group appeared. Then the third. By the time Caleb came up behind Marin to look over her shoulder from the porch, there were 6 sleds visible below each one, pulled by figures moving with the grinding efficiency of people who are almost done. The supply train from the territorial depot had come down an alternate route, a longer, rougher track through the Bitterroot Range that the territorial office had known existed, but had never used because it was brutal in good weather and theoretically impossible in winter. Apparently, they'd revised the definition of theoretical. The first 2 men reached the base of the ridge, stopped, looked up. One of them shielded his eyes. His voice carried up through the sharp April air with the clarity of all sounds after long silence. "Harlow Flat, anyone alive up here?" The children answered before Marin could. 4 of them from the porch, producing a volume that was disproportionate to their size. Caleb let out one sound, a sharp involuntary exhalation, that he covered immediately by walking back inside, though Marin noticed that he took a moment at the doorframe, both hands on the woodhead briefly down. Roy Drum stood at the edge of the porch with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated in the direction of the arriving sleds. He didn't cheer, he just stood there and breathed, which was its own kind of statement. When the delegation from the supply train made it up the ridge an hour later, 5 men, the ones physically capable of the climb. They stood in Marin's clearing and looked at the cabin still smoking, at the organized yard, at the drying racks that had been running even in the depths of February, at the 19 people who emerged from the structure in various states of thin but upright. The man in charge had a ledger. He opened it, pencil ready, the practical efficiency of someone whose job was accounting for survival. "How many?" he asked, and the answer was 19, and he wrote it down, and then he looked up at Marin and asked the question that would be asked many times in the coming weeks: how? She was quiet for a moment. Around her, the children were moving toward the sleds, with the contained excitement of bodies that remembered what plenty felt like and were relearning the sensation. Wren had Hazel on her hip, which she'd taken to doing with the casual competence of someone who'd been managing infants for years rather than weeks. "I watched the clouds," Marin said. "I remembered what they'd cost me before." The man wrote something in his ledger, though she suspected what she'd said didn't translate to the kind of notation his ledger was designed for. The town's delegation came a week later, after the pass road had been cleared enough for a horse to manage it. They came with money, with goods, with the particular combination of guilt and relief that communities carry when they've been forced to revise their understanding of who among them had been paying attention. The Territorial Council sent a letter. She read it once, fed it to the fire, which had become her preferred response to paperwork that required something she wasn't interested in giving. The offer to name this new town square after her was delivered by Emery Dunn, the Reverend's son, who'd grown several inches since October and acquired a frost scar along his right cheekbone that he'd carry for the rest of his life. He delivered the offer with the straightforwardness of someone who suspects it will be declined, but believes in the dignity of making it properly. Marin was in the garden when he arrived, not planting yet, the ground still too cold, but turning the soil with a fork, working in the compost she'd been building from the winter's kitchen waste. Reading the Earth's readiness, the way you read any system you know well. She listened to the offer, kept the fork moving. "Tell them to plant something useful in the square instead." She turned another section of soil. "Anything they can eat come fall." Emery smiled, which changed his face significantly. "They'll want to know what to plant." She stopped, straightened, looked at the mountains where the snow line was visibly retreating up the slopes, half an inch of brown rock becoming visible along the ridgeline every few days. "Beans, they're forgiving. They put nitrogen back in the soil. Plant them and they make the ground better for whatever comes next." She looked at Emery. "That's either practical advice or a philosophy. Tell them they can decide which." He left with the message. She went back to the soil. The teaching began in May, when the trail up the ridge was dry enough to make the climb something other than dangerous. They came in groups of 8 or 10 children mostly, but parents too. Some of the parents she recognized, some she didn't. Some she recognized but had to relearn because the winter had changed their faces in the way that hard experience changes faces, adding a specific gravity around the eyes that wasn't there before. Her first lesson was always the same question: what was the most important tool they had? They gave the expected answers. She waded through all of them. "Time," she said. "Before you need anything else, you need time. Time you made by working in the summer so the winter has less to take from you." The follow-up never varied either. How do you protect time by not wasting what it produces? She made them say it back to her. She made them write it in the plain ledger pages she gave them because fancy implied a permanence she wasn't promising. She was promising utility. Silas Pruitt, his leg recovered to the point of function, if not full restoration, taught the observation curriculum he'd been developing since February. It ran to 30 pages by June, organized by season and indicator, with drawings he'd made himself in a cramped but accurate hand frost, crystal formations, animal track patterns, cloud formations over mountain passes, the behavior of creek ice at specific temperatures. The children learned to read these the way earlier generations of children in this valley had learned to read the almanac, except that what Pruitt taught them was verifiable, updatable, grounded in observation, rather than calculation performed in a city by someone who'd never seen this particular sky. Harlow Flat later had 12 copies made. Caleb, 18 now, with the permanent quality of someone who finished growing into himself during a winter that would have finished a person of lesser internal structure, built the second drying shed that summer. Taller than the first, framed in hardwood he'd sourced from timber that had come down in the storms, with a rack system he'd designed himself based on 3 seasons of working alongside Marin. He didn't ask her to review the plans. He built it, let her walk through it, watched her check the angles and the airflow without comment. She made one adjustment, a small brace on the northwest corner that improved the wind resistance. He added the brace that afternoon. That was the entirety of their conversation about it. Roy Drum stayed on the ridge. He'd been offered his old place in Harlow Flat. Such as it was, the house had survived structurally, though someone had taken the door and 2 windows during December, which in the context of that December was not a crime anyone was in a position to prosecute. He looked at the offer, looked at the ridge, told Caleb he thought he'd stay a while longer. Caleb said that was fine. Neither of them elaborated on what fine meant, or how long a while was, or whether the offer was temporary cover for something that had already become permanent. Some decisions make themselves and only require acknowledgement. Dex Holt went back down to Harlow Flat in April. He had land to assess, a herd to rebuild from the few cattle that had survived, a house with glass windows that needed everything the winter had taken from it put back. He came back up the ridge in June to help with the second drying shed, spending 3 days on the framing without being asked. On the last day before he descended, he stood at Owen Marsh's grave for a few minutes. The carved pine branch was still there on the marker, more weathered now. He touched it once with 2 fingers, then went down the ridge. Marin watched him go from the garden and didn't try to name what she was looking at. She went back to the beans. By August, Cinder Notch Ridge had become a community in the way that unplanned communities become communities, not by declaration, but by the accumulation of shared practice, shared memory, shared understanding of what had been survived. 3 cabins now, plus the root cellar built into the south slope, plus the communal smokehouse that Caleb had laid out and Roy Drum had helped raise. A kitchen garden that 5 households tended collectively, with a rotation system for the heavier work that had been modified by the people using it in ways Marin hadn't anticipated, which she took as evidence that it was working. The drying racks were more extensive that summer than they'd been the summer before. Not because anything had been formally decided about this, but because people who had spent a winter understanding precisely what those racks meant had no uncertainty about their value. Everyone dried everything. The children dried things that probably didn't need drying from a strict survival standpoint. It had become a practice, a reflex, the physical language of a community that had learned to read time differently. When the 2nd November came, it arrived quietly. No dramatic entry, no single night of transformation. Just the temperature dropping in the way temperatures drop when a long cold season is beginning, incremental patient, the mountain taking back what it always takes back. The passes closed. The supply road became theoretical again for the months when theory was the best anyone could offer. No one panicked. No one ran out of wood in the first week. No infants died in the night from cold that crept through inadequate walls. Smoke rose from every chimney on the ridge, steady and unhurried, the visible evidence of people who had thought about this specific morning while the sun was still warm. In the 3rd week of November, Marin walked down to Harlow Flat for the first time since the previous autumn. She went alone in the early morning before the day's work had properly begun. She walked through a town that was different from the one she'd known, smaller in population. Larger in a quality she didn't have a precise word for, something like sobriety, in the non-alcoholic sense, the particular gravity of people who've revised their assumptions about what the world owes them. Walt Gideon came out of the trading post when she passed. He had a jar of sugar in his hand, the gesture of a man who's been waiting for the opportunity to make it, who's rehearsed the exact amount of casualness to project. He held it out on the house Marin. She looked at the jar. She looked at Walt. She smiled, not the careful economy of expression version she'd been operating with for 3 years, but something more direct, something that acknowledged him in the jar and the specific character of what he was trying to do. She didn't take the jar. She patted his arm once the briefest contact enough to complete the circuit, then kept walking. He stood on the porch of Gideon's trading post and watched her go, and he didn't look like a man who'd been declined. He looked like a man who'd received something. In January, the Valley held a gathering at the new schoolhouse. Not a dance, not a sermon, not a political meeting. Just everyone who remained in Harlow Flat seated in a circle around the wood stove, passing broth in tin cups, tearing flatbread that June Hollowell had baked from the winter flower stores. They read names, 37 of them, the ones who hadn't made it through the year. After each name, a child came forward to place a stone in a wooden bowl. Owen Marsh was read first, and Wren placed his stone herself with both hands, carefully the way you place something you intend the world to remember. When the reading was done, the bowl came to Marin. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the accumulated mass of 37 decisions that the winter had made for 37 people who'd run out of options at various points between November and March. She stood, walked to the stove, poured the stones into the fire. The flames moved around them, then over them, hissing and popping with the specific sound of cold objects warming. The room was silent for a long time. No one moved to fill the silence. It existed for its own reasons, that silence holding the density of what can't be said more effectively than words could. On the walk back up the ridge that night, Wren moved beside Marin through the cold dark with Hazel bundled against her chest, the baby's breath making small clouds in the lantern light. After a while, Wren spoke in the conversational tone she used for observations that mattered. "I told Emery Dunn what the dry house means. He asked if it was because of all the food you dried." Marin walked. "What did you tell him?" Wren considered this with the deliberateness she brought to all questions that deserved it. "I told him it's because you dried your tears too." She looked up at Marin. "Was that right?" The lantern swung slightly in the wind. Above them, the ridge was a dark shape against a sky crowded with stars, the specific, brutal clarity of a Montana winter sky when the cold has pressed every particle of moisture out of the air and left nothing between the earth and the stars but distance. Marin didn't answer right away. She looked at the stars, then at the trail ahead, then at the small woman beside her, carrying a baby she'd named without permission and kept without question. "Come on," she finally said. "It's a long walk back." Caleb was waiting at the top with the porch light burning. He held the gate open and counted them in the old reflex, the one that had become so habitual, he probably didn't know he was doing it anymore. Inside, the fire was doing what it had been doing since November of last year, burning steadily with the patient consistency of something tended by people who understood what its absence meant. Roy Drum had banked it properly before the gathering, the oak logs positioned for the long burn. Marin stood at the fire for a moment, warming her hands. The cabin around her held its evening sounds. Wren settling Hazel into the sleeping corner, the low voices of the adults returning to their own thoughts, the complete and unremarkable absence of the silence that had lived here alone for 3 years. Caleb sat down across the fire from her. He was quiet for a while in the way he'd become quiet, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who was measuring what they were about to say against what it was worth. "You think they'll remember it, right?" His voice was careful. What this winter actually was. Marin looked at the fire. She turned her hands toward the warmth, slowly feeling the heat reach into the joints that stayed cold longest. "No," she said. "Not the way we know it. The cold won't be as cold in the telling. The hunger won't be as long." He considered this. Then what was the point, the teaching? Pruitt's notebook. All of it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain in the long, slow way it came down in deep winter, finding the corners of the cabin, pressing along the walls. The fire moved with it, just slightly acknowledging the pressure without surrendering to it. "They won't remember the winter," she said, "but they'll remember what to do in August. Their hands will remember before their minds do the way, to hold a knife against a fish, the angle of a drying rack, the amount of salt." She looked up at him. When the hard thing comes back, they won't need to remember me. They'll just start working. She paused. That's the whole point. That's all of it. Caleb looked at the fire for a long time after that. He didn't argue with it, and he didn't agree in any verbal way. He simply received it the way you receive something you know you'll be carrying for a long time. Wren appeared from the sleeping corner with Hazel already quiet against her shoulder, stood in the firelight for a moment looking at both of them, then returned to her corner without a word. The baby's small breathing was audible in the stillness. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Cinder Notch Ridge, covering the drying racks, covering the graves, covering the garden beds, where beans would push through in 4 months' time. It covered the new smokehouse and the root cellar and the trail that connected this place to the valley below. Marin added wood to the fire. The oak caught slowly the way good wood does not in a rush, but with intention building towards something that would last. She checked the damper, listened to the snow find the roof, and settled there patient, as everything the winter asked of the people beneath it. The ring at her collar was warm from her skin. She touched it once briefly through the cloth, the small circle of Eric's sevens and Eric's plans, and Eric's belief that a man who prepared carefully enough would be there to see what he'd prepared for. She had spent 3 years becoming something he hadn't had time to become. She had spent 3 years learning that preparation was not a hedge against loss. It was the only honest answer to it, the only thing you could build that the cold couldn't take. She took her hand away from the collar. She looked at the fire, at the faces of the sleeping children arranged around its warmth, at Caleb, keeping his quiet watch at the organized walls of a cabin that had held 19 people through the hardest winter in the territory's memory and had not broken. The fire burned. It burned through the night as it had burned every night since November of 1886, tended by hands that understood what tending meant. Not the grand gesture, not the single heroic act, but the repeated, unglamorous essential work of adding the next piece of wood before the last one turned to ash. At midnight, Marin added wood. At 3, she added wood. At 5, when the first gray light began to show at the window's edge, and the birds in the pines began their tentative consultation with the morning, she added wood. The fire did not go out.